I'm very sorry. Let me welcome everyone to this ICVA launch of our report, Risk Sharing in Pooled Funds. My name is Elise Baudot. I am the head of humanitarian financing at ICVA. ICVA, as many of you know, now we're proud to say has 178 NGO members, and we are a network working for principled and effective humanitarian action. Our members are international, national, local, from across the globe. For us, this report and this subject are extremely timely. ICVA is a very big fan of pooled funds, both country-based pooled funds, the regional-based pooled funds, and the NGO-led funds, the feminist funds, the refugee-led funds, locally led funds. For us, pooled fund mechanisms are an extremely important vehicle to finance effectively local and national actors. And as many of you know, effective risk management and risk sharing and perceptions of risk are excessively important, both to, of course, to ensure that humanitarian action happens, is delivered as we need it to be, but also is a very strong component of ensuring quality financing, especially to local and national actors. Pooled funds, given the magnitude of funding that they do to local and national actors, both directly and indirectly, and given their governance structures and given their inclusiveness between donors, funding experts, and the fundees, the local and national actors, are a really great vehicle to both pilot, test, come up with good practices in risk sharing and effective risk management. So through this report, we wanted to have a better glimpse of that. What were the good practices that pooled funds are doing now in risk sharing, especially towards financing local and national actors? What are new sort of innovative practices out there that could be better scaled, better used? And as well, where are there still challenges and opportunities? We really thank in advance the 700 persons who have signed up for this launch event, including giving us a whole raft of questions that you have in this space. Unfortunately, in this short hour and a half, we'll never be able to answer all those questions. And we won't be able to even dive deeply into the subject matter as much as we would like to, but we hope to really give you both a flavor of the report itself, what came out of it, and probe certain aspects of it with our panelists today. So without further ado, a few housekeeping matters. One is that we are recording this and transcribing it. We will put out a recording publicly afterward, and we'll try to do a blog event as well, just to keep the subject matter going and deepening. We only have an hour and a half, but we really do want to make this as interactive as possible. We have 5 speakers, but all of them will try to make it relatively short. So we will try to have at least a half an hour at the end for questions and answers, but please do not hesitate to use the chat button to both put in comments and questions or share other resources or thoughts that you may have that will feed into our blog of this event afterward, as well as I'll be monitoring it and try to I'll try to do justice to any main questions that are coming out of it. And then we do hope to have a live interactive session with you asking questions, but I really ask you in advance to really be as short as possible, just to say questions in that time, so we can have as many questions and probe further into some of the subjects as you would be interested. So again, really, really thank you very much. Very welcome. Let me now, without further ado, introduce to you our primary author of the report, Mr. Ed Hughes. So Ed Hughes, if you've been working in the risk sharing space, you have definitely seen him and heard his name. Ed has worked for many years in different countries with various NGOs, and he's really, I don't know, Ed, for the last 4 or 5 years, been very much focused on risk sharing, working with grant bargain signatories on the risk sharing framework, and on moving it forward to more sort of operationalizing of it, including working very closely with OCHA and the CBPF team, which then leads me to my introduction of my first panelist, which will be Martina Di Benedetto. Martina is OCHA's Deputy Chief of Oversight and Compliance Section, responsible for risk prevention, detection, and response for OCHA-managed pooled funds. And that includes SURF and the CBPFs and the regional CBPFs, of course, as well. Martina, as we said, I'm just going to focus on titles, but Martina has a very long experience in pooled funds and in OCHA, and also in supporting even grassroots local NGOs. So you go, again, knowing very well that this topic matter of effective financing to local and national actors and the management of risk for one of the biggest pooled fund families, for humanitarian pooled fund families. Our next speaker will be Fabio Pellegrino. Fabio is the head of risk for the Aid Fund for Syria. We've asked Fabio and the Aid Fund to Syria to join us because one thing they're doing is launching a very interesting concept called the Anchor Organization, which is really trying to look at this concept of the sort of intermediary, the sub-grantor, and their risk and how to share that risk more effectively. So Fabio, really looking to hearing from you on that. Fabio, again, has a very long experience, if I understand correctly, around risk management in general, with working in multi-sectoral and multi-countries in managing risk. Then very, very happy to welcome Victoria Tayler. Victoria Tayler is the Executive Director of the Risk Pool Alliance. The Risk Pool Alliance is working with numerous foundations, including the VTOL Foundation, which we will have Federico on the panel afterward, looking at how to basically collaborate more effectively and help fund where things go wrong, be an insurance mechanism, right, for the delivery chain actors. And again, Victoria comes with 20 years of experience working with donors and sort of implementers in navigating complex policy and funding landscapes in this grant world. Last but not least, very happy to welcome Federico. Federico is a longtime collaborator of mine personally. He heads up the emergencies and humanitarian portfolio at the VTOL Foundation. Comes with very long experience, again, working with NGOs in the Middle East and in South and Southeast Asia. And in the VTOL Foundation, really spearheading the financing to local and national organizations. And we'll hear much more about that, including the mutual aid groups in South Sudan. So without further, no, in Sudan, very sorry, in Sudan. So without further ado, let me pass over the floor to Ed, who will give a summary of the report, and then we will go directly into our various panelists. Thanks, Ed. Over to you.
Hello, everyone, and very nice to be speaking to you today. And I have to say, I'm extremely pleased to see so many of our local colleagues from various national and local organisations across the world on the call here today. You are the centre of this conversation, and your voices need to be heard. So thank you for sparing your valuable time to join us. I'm going to share my screen, so apologies if the tech goes over my head for a second while I do this. I'm not going to speak at length. The report is there. We want to try and give as much time as possible to the conversation around this. And I have to say, in advance, this won't be a conversation that allows me to say, this is where you can get money from, or this is how we're going to improve, at least in the short term, how we're able to get funding to people who need it most. But hopefully it will help us with the conversation and the discourse. So let me start. Elise, can you just jump in and tell me whether you're seeing lots of pop-ups come up in front of this presentation, because that might be irritating for people.
So far not. We just see the
okay,
slide.
All right, it's just me. It's just me. Okay, that's fine if it's only me. Right, so I will just remind you why we're talking about this. We're talking about humanitarian response, and when we think about global caseloads, one of the real challenges for us is that 75% of caseloads are concentrated in maybe 7 or 8 countries, and these are all high-risk environments for humanitarian operations. So they're tricky places for us to work, and we rely on risk management to enable our response. The problem is we're all quite aware that over time, our risk management is perhaps not seeming to be as effective as it should be. And I think our assumption within this that is risk sharing is actually the missing element of effective risk management approaches for humanitarian action rather than, for example, commercial operations. And if we can share more risk in the delivery chain, so when I say delivery chain, I'm talking about back donors, I'm talking about pooled funds, maybe prime grant recipients, those larger NGOs, and then our frontline responders, more commonly, at the moment at least, in that sub-granting relationship. If we can share more risk more equitably throughout that delivery chain, we can handle and absorb more risk more responsibly as a whole. And that means we'll be able to reach more people. So that's why risk sharing is important. So our purpose, our objective within this work was really to sort of try and find out, what risk sharing is already happening, how can we improve it, how can we scale it, how can we overcome challenges so that we can have a scalable positive impact on the global response, which should be localized. So just a couple of words on the focus and methodology for this work. As I said at the start, we know that there's 7 or 8 countries that are seeing maybe 3/4 of humanitarian caseloads. And our assumption, our thinking was, although these look very different on the surface as individual country responses from a risk perspective, we also have this sneaking suspicion from other research that some of these risk landscapes are actually quite similar. So we wanted to test that. And we also wanted to recognize that if we can try and unpick responses, those challenges in some of these bigger country responses, we can scale solutions in a way that would have a massive global impact. So that's what we were thinking. In terms of who we wanted to speak to, we've got country-based pooled funds with OCHA, which are obviously a major player. So we wanted to look at 1 or 2 of those. So we're looking at the Sudan Humanitarian Fund as a key sample. But we also wanted to see other UN-led funds. We wanted to see NGO-led funds, including those from the START network. And we wanted to understand a bit about commercially led funds as well, because these are all types of fund managers who come with different skills, different experience, different approaches. And we wanted to understand whether there were particular lessons from some of these or others that could help us in terms of seeing best practice or common challenges. So we looked at different publicly and privately available information, and we interviewed many of the back donors and the prime grant recipients, who were quite often, but not always, INGOs, and also a number of our direct implementing partners. So that was quite commonly local actors, but not exclusively. I'm just going to jump straight into some of the things that we've seen. Now, we know when we look at risk landscapes, when we talk to different delivery chain actors, that quite often we don't actually see a consistent picture of risk when we speak to different people. It's really common to speak to a back donor and hear about fiduciary risks, or corruption, fraud, or ethical risk, things like PSEA and safeguarding issues. When you speak to frontline actors, they are razor sharp focused on thinking about safety and security risks, particularly for their personnel, but also for their assets. And they're thinking about how to get their response operationalized. They're thinking about access. They're thinking about compliance risks associated with their contracts. The interesting thing from this research, looking at pooled funds, is that actually when we ask these 3 groups of functional actors, the direct implementers, the pooled funds themselves, and the back donors, they have a very clear and consistent and shared picture of what the landscape of risk is. And that's great, because before you can start doing anything on risk sharing, you have to be able to come up with a common shared understanding of what the risk actually is. And I think it's probably safe to say that the reason for that is that we tend to see pooled fund management units more locally embedded at a field level in the countries where they're operating. We have our direct implementers more engaged in the governance structures, and even the donor representatives are quite often either co-located in country, or they're much more sort of familiar and focused on that particular pooled fund as an area of work. So this is really useful. And three of the big risks that came up were these security risks around assets and personnel, operational risks. This was more about making sure that we could get the right types of partners involved at the right stage of the response, and particularly local partners. And the third aspect, which is a bit more concerning, was around operational risks for partners relating to donor compliance. So basically, partners, and to be fair to pooled funds and donors, also those actors being acutely aware that there are actually risks for partners with just complying with contract terms. Those risks are being generated because of what's in the contract. And then to a lesser extent, those other risks we're seeing around legal and regulatory compliance, informational risks. And last of all, actually, amongst these people we interviewed, were questions of fiduciary risk and ethical risk, and reputational risk I'll leave off to one side as a sort of second order consequence. But the interesting thing is, when you consider our actual risk management frameworks, as particularly donors and pooled funds and prime grant recipients, the larger NGOs, they tend to be loaded with unilateral measures to deal with fiduciary risk and ethical risk. But at the same time, we're not actually necessarily seeing those risks being suggested as being major critical risks in these environments that we're looking at. So that's something to be aware of. The next thing I just wanted to mention, it became increasingly clear as we looked at these various stakeholders within the delivery chains that the ISO 31000 risk management standard, so this is a commercial global standard, has become quite a common basis for most large organizations' risk management approaches. And that is actually a little bit problematic because, to be honest, it's quite a Western-centric framework. It doesn't really take into account, for example, local accountability to affected population mechanisms, the sort of bottom-up mechanisms that could be really useful in a risk management approach, but aren't necessarily conducive to being incorporated in these ISO 31000 style approaches. It's also really quite heavy, right? In terms of having to identify risk and risk registers, talk about treatment options, using this quite impenetrable language. And that makes it quite exclusionary. It makes it quite difficult to incorporate unless you have the scale to afford it, and you have the sort of staff who are able to engage with that language. And what that tends to mean is that pooled funds, and this isn't specific to pooled funds, but we see it in pooled funds, it incentivizes granting to larger organizations as prime recipients. And the problem with that is that larger organizations tend to be international. They are less likely to be local. So we're seeing a situation where our risk management approach is not enabling localization as part of our delivery. It may be enabling more nationalization, but we're really clear, right, that nationalization is not synonymous with localization. We have large, successful national NGOs, and that's great, but that's not necessarily the box that we're trying to open up and unpack when we talk about localization. So this is quite problematic for us. And within that, it's creating a bit of an issue because it's creating this really important role for intermediaries, prime grant recipients working as sub-grantors to channel money to local partners. But that's creating a huge amount of pressure on that role, and that's something that I will come back to. It's not all bad news. We're definitely making progress on preventive risk-sharing measures. So this is the bit about sharing the burden of reducing the likelihood that risks will occur in the first place. This is the one of the two legs of effective risk sharing. And in this, we can see, for example, that we're getting slightly better, slowly, at seeing better budgeting for things like security costs. We're seeing more flexibility in the way that that budgeting is being done. We're seeing the introduction in some country contexts like Ukraine of minimum duty of care standards being incorporated into proposal design and project implementation. And we're seeing work to improve commercial insurance coverage as well. We're also seeing on the reactive side, so this is the other leg of effective risk sharing, where we're seeking to reduce the impact of risk consequences. So when a risk still happens, as it inevitably will, we're seeing use of discretionary authority on the part of donors and pooled funds and sometimes prime grant recipients to effectively forgive or declare eligible costs of certain types of loss, for example, so things like looting or theft. Quite commonly, this is being declared eligible after the fact on a discretionary basis. We're also seeing measures to broaden access for local partners. So this is things like expedited eligibility processes. We're seeing tiered approaches to due diligence, so simplified approaches to capacity assessment, all sorts of things to try and help local partners at least get in at the ground floor and then build up their ability to work within these sort of more complex approaches. And we're also seeing some measures to reduce the risks of non-compliance for partners in the field. So, things like, for example, the use of donation or micro grant agreements in Sudan is very helpful for local partners and for intermediaries to try and reduce the sort of the data burden that they're facing. We're seeing in some other countries like Myanmar efforts to say, look, you don't need to keep everything in hard copy because we recognize that's a risk. We can use more digital copies. And then changes to things like standard reporting requirements in order to react to what are the common issues. However, we do have some serious issues that we need to discuss, and I think these will be the things we seek to unpack as I pass on to my learned colleagues on the panel. It is shocking that to many of our downstream partners in pooled fund delivery chains, one of the biggest risks that they actually perceive are their ability to comply with contract terms of their pooled funds or of their prime grant recipients. This isn't anyone's individual fault. This is a problem and a challenge we're seeing across the delivery chain of pooled funds, across the board as a whole. These contract terms are the way that in an ISO-style risk management approach, you are seeking to unilaterally offset and deal with risk. But the result is we are transferring risk within the delivery chain. And it's hugely problematic because if we rely on each other to achieve our shared objectives, if we transfer risk to someone else and they can't deal with it, they are going to change their actions in a way that will negatively impact our ability to achieve our objectives. And that's going to have a knock-on effect back to us. So we need to consider this for our own sakes, as well as seeing it as a moral obligation. And within that, a big part is this issue of sharing risk consequences. We've become very, very good now at sharing the burden of preventive measures, but we're still quite queasy about saying upfront we can share risk consequences. And I'll come back to that a little bit, because we tend to sort of say, we'll share risk consequences, but we want to do it on our terms. We want to rely on our discretion to do it. And that's hugely problematic from a point of view of equitable partnership. If you are already holding all the power as a donor or a pooled fund or a prime grant recipient, and then you revert to using discretionary clauses, you really are massively overstepping in terms of the power dynamic of that relationship. It makes it very unpredictable for the person that you're dealing with. And if it's unpredictable for them, they are less likely to be able to take a sort of measured risk approach. So A big problem within this is going to be the role of the intermediary. We know that most risk is transferred contractually from both donors to pooled funds and to the prime grant recipients acting as sub-grantors. If they do not have the means to address the risks that have been transferred and they cannot absorb a risk consequence, the only thing we are leaving them able to do is to pile on more compliance to try and further reduce and prevent the likelihood of the risk occurring in the first place. So when we see constantly this question of why is it harder to work through a sub-grantor, whether it's an INGO or a national NGO, the reason is because they've loaded up risk in that bottleneck. We haven't been able to think about it. I'm going to be asking my colleagues from AFS to comment a little bit on what they've been doing on that shortly. But where do we go next? Well, we know we need more equity and partnership in risk management. We're going to need to continue our work on preventive measures. I'm going to be expecting our colleagues from OCHA to sort of speak a bit to what they're doing in that space. And we're going to need to continue the fairly unglamorous work of trying to chip back a little bit on our contractual terms. We must reimagine the role of the sub-grantor, and we must expand and increase the predictability of measures to address risk consequences. That's my closing thought, and I'll pass back to Elise and look forward to hearing from the other panelists. Thank you.
Ed, really thank you so much for that. Again, does not do justice to the full report and all the sort of richness of it, but I hope it really gives you a really good flavor of the key issues that came out that, as Ed said, that we need to collectively work on. And just to also say that Ed gave the same presentation to the community of practice of pooled fund managers on Tuesday as well. So it is something that's on the radar of the pooled fund managers themselves. So just to say it'll be a continued work in progress. So without further ado, let me hand over to Martina first. Martina, within your role as oversight risk compliance head for the CBPFs and SURF, would really be looking forward to hearing from you in terms of your work around risk sharing. Where are you going with this? What have you been challenges? What have been the sort of wins going forward? And where do you see it going forward from here? Thanks. Over to you, Martina.
Thank you so much, Elise and Ed, and it's really nice to to see so many of us online. I think this really is a testament of the to the importance of this topic, Elise, that you've been able to to have so many colleagues register for this event. I think for for OCHA and the OCHA managed pool funds, we have soon into our journey, very early into our journey towards localization, we've realized that actually a more equitable approach to risk management and risk sharing was a key precondition for genuine localization. We realized that funding, participation in policymaking, in governance, capacity development were not enough if our compliance and kind of risk management practices were still very much top-down, transferring the risk down to the local and national actors. So that's how OCHA and OCHA's pool funds have kind of come to join the risk-sharing family community of practice, really. And over the past 2 or 3 years, we've been working closely with many of you, with the risk-sharing task force, as well as Ed, to really unpack in very practical terms what the concept of risk-sharing means in the operational realities that our funds work in. So we've been engaging very closely, our key stakeholders, international and national NGOs, the UN agencies, but also our donors and the advisory boards of the various country and regional funds. And then we've also had quite in-depth discussions with our stakeholders internally within OCHA, our fund managers, heads of offices, but also the UN Secretariat that really governs OCHA. And out of all this kind of engagement, there's been just a shared acknowledgement that risk sharing is not necessarily about taking on more risk, but more about managing the risk more equitably. in a more collaborative way and in a more effective way, so that we can kind of balance out, the risk appetites of different actors in our pool fund delivery chains, but also their capacities to absorb risk, because we're not equal. We're not all the same in terms of our ability to absorb risks and the cost of prevention or responding to risk, like Ed was saying. So based on these discussions in 2023, we launched 2 pilots of risk sharing in the two kind of largest pool funds that we manage, the Sudan Humanitarian Fund and the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund. Both funds operate in highly complex environments. And actually what we realized is exactly what Ed was hinting at, which despite the very different contexts and situations, in reality, the types of risks that our funds and the funds partners were facing were quite similar. And how we were responding to those risks was also similar, but it wasn't necessarily context appropriate. So, our funds were facing operational risks, right? They didn't have the right set of partners to respond to the needs that we were seeing on the ground. There was a reduced availability of partners in both countries, in both crises. And so we needed to tap into different organizations that were able to deliver aid from point A to point B. To address these risks and the issues that came with it, we've done quite a lot of work on the preventative side of risk sharing. So really kind of trying to unpack our approaches to eligibility and due diligence that were hindering us. Our risk management was so strong that actually we didn't have enough partners to implement, because we were trying to prevent risks, right? So we introduced a waiver to our regular eligibility process to basically use other sources of information, assessments done by other donors, by other funds. And so there you can see that the risk sharing component is really accepting to fund organizations and so put our money and our reputation at stake based on, information collected and verified by others. So there's really something powerful, I think, in passporting that eligibility information. We also piloted a tiered approach to eligibility, where we were willing to lower our standards and give out smaller grants with less heavy compliance requirements and a capacity development component. And we also started piloting with the concept of micro grants, particularly in Sudan, to the mutual aid groups and the community-based responders. We then were facing quite a lot of compliance risks, right? The partners needed increased flexibility for project implementation, given the circumstances and the lack of predictability of the operating context. And so we looked at some of the compliance requirements, of our contractual requirements, right? Ed, you were talking about grant agreements and contractual requirements, and we kind of allowed some flexibility in some of those to allow our partners to become more effective. So, for example, one of the key things that we did was really reconceptualize one of our allocation modalities. It's called the 48-hour allocation modality. It's basically a pre-positioning of funding in a way. It's almost like a rapid response mechanism. And we redesigned it to allow partners to be able to more flexibly design their budgets and their activities when they knew what were the needs, where were the needs, and how they were going to respond the needs, who they were going to pass money to respond to the needs. We've looked at alternative money transfer service providers. We've looked at flexibilities around, the reporting requirements. We've spent quite a lot of time looking at what happens when the partners lose supporting documents, and how do we respond to those kind of incidents in a way that doesn't penalize the organizations that actually agreed to take on the responsibility of implementing a response in a context where they knew that they were ready, that they would likely face the risk of losing the supporting documents. And last but not least, we put in place a lot of measures to deal with risks when they materialize. As Ed was saying, that's the toughest part. That was, in our experience, the toughest part, right? Obviously, there's quite a lot of kind of force majeure incidents that you face in active conflicts. So we did quite a lot of work to try and define what are the criteria to basically give predictability to our partners on under what circumstances they could expect OCHA to cover the financial losses resulting from theft, looting, bombing that affected their assets, that affected their premises, that affected their supplies, etc. And then we did also a lot of work with our NGO partners on duty of care. So when you can't offer, medical or life insurance to your staff, particularly, the frontline responders that are more exposed to safety and security risks for their personnel, what alternative options can we provide and fund for our partners to cover those costs for their staff? And again, like the element of predictability and standardization was really important. So NGOs knew what they could get going into a grant agreement with OCHA. So I think we've done a lessons learned review after these pilots, and we've had a lot of positive findings, in the sense that there's been an overall kind of net benefit coming out of these pilots. We're still, this is kind of a long-term endeavor, right? So we can't know right now what's the final impact, but so far we have seen really a minimal negative impact on our funds, on our resources, actually much more transparency and openness. We couldn't have done humanitarian response in Ukraine and in Sudan had these measures not been in place, right? Our NGOs wouldn't have accepted the money even because the risk was too high for them. And also, I think what we learned, which is key, is that there's a common misconception that risk sharing requires one actor to take on more risk so that another actor can experience less risk. But actually, this is not true, so it's not a zero-sum game, but it's a win-win game, right? Because by enabling different actors in the response to manage risk more openly and more appropriately, you're actually reducing the collateral risks that could be generated by unilateral risk management practices, right? I'm covering my own risks, so then your risk increases and you have to take adverse risk management decisions. And so I think this is really interesting, and it also speaks to what Ed was saying about the role of intermediaries, how risk transfer generates risk management decisions that are rational for one actor, but actually cause more collateral damage for other actors. And so that was really interesting. So just 1 more minute on next steps, where we go from here, right? I think today, we all know that the humanitarian sector is at a critical juncture, right? We're experiencing an existential crisis, and we are all trying to figure out what this kind of humanitarian reset could look like. But, we've done a lot of soul searching in OCHA. We've conducted a very extensive assessment of what could be the role of pool funds, the OCHA pool funds, but also more generally humanitarian pool funds in shaping this reset. And obviously, everything that came out speaks to the need to expand locally led action, to really empower the local responders, and one of the key findings that many responders actually mentioned was the need to recalibrate our risk management approaches, so that risk management actually doesn't hinder the response, but becomes provide support to locally led response. So we have identified a set of sharing measures beyond what we've already implemented that we are going to be piloting, testing, and designing over the past over the next 6 months or so. And these really look at diversifying eligibility modalities, expanding the way in which we fund, so expanding the typology of delivery chains that pooled funds support, and then looking at the element of sharing risks more equitably when they materialize. So watch this space. There's going to be more consultation and more work going on, but really looking forward to engaging in the discussion with all of you. Thanks, Elise.
Martina, thank you very much. Really encouraging and super interesting to hear. Underlying everything that you do, which is the fundamental of risk sharing, is a true dialogue and understanding of the risk faced by the partners. And this win-win idea of how what each one can do to lighten that risk burden for everybody. As you said, not a zero-sum game, but of a sharing. And thank you for the really concrete examples. We'll definitely have you back in 6 months to see and to hear where it's going. Really, really interesting. Let me now hand over to Fabio and the Aid Fund for Syria and hear a bit more on what you're doing, especially with the anchor organizations, to fund more community-based organizations. Fabio, over to you.
Thank you, Elise, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to present. It's like I find a family, so very exciting. We speak the same language. That's great. So just to give you a very brief background of AFS, or Aid Fund for Syria, is humanitarian multi-donor pool fund that work through INGO and NGO across Syria in all the humanitarian sectors, right? So what I'll try to walk you through today is like the anchor organization concept and the risk sharing measures that we are currently trying to operationalize and to implement. These are kind of two interconnected elements of our broader localization strategy, aim at enabling a responsible and sustainable partnership with grassroots organizations and CBLAs. So the anchor concept was developed to operationalize the AFS localization strategy in Syria, where many small community-based organizations and grassroots actors are at the heart of the response, but for all the reasons that we know and we already partially discussed and cover, do not meet the criteria for direct funding. So this, what we try to identify was a solution to this, right? So the model is based on the idea of working with and through qualified AFS partners, these anchor organizations, and the anchor organization are combine the operational capacity with a demonstrated commitment to partnership, power sharing, and the long-term growth of local actors. So there is a commitment toward towards the long-term growth of local actors. So again, the anchor organization concept is it kind of act as a bridge between the fund and the CBLAs, right? By channeling funding, investing in capacity strengthening, supporting program delivery and compliance, but especially, I would say, most important is promoting the genuine participation and leadership of local actors. So again, I think the point that this is not about subcontracting, right? It's a deliberate, locally grounded partnerships that help us kind of reach those closer to the affected communities, right? So the selection of anchor organization is tied not just to the capacity, again, but it's also about the values and the behaviors such as collaboration, transparency, and readiness to work in equal partnership with the smaller actors. So the AFS anchor concept was endorsed by the steering board around 1 year ago. I think it was August 2024, and including the adoption of a risk-sharing framework designed to reduce the exposure of anchor organization when working with CBLAs. So among the measures foreseen in this framework, there is the introduction and the use of a reserve funds, right? So So this mechanism aim to ensure that the liability for unforeseen risks and compliance-related risk, but not only compliance-related risk, is more equitable distributed between AFS and its partners. So the principle of the reserve fund is very basic. It's very simple. So if the partner has done their part in the prevention and the monitoring measure, and this is linked somehow to the negligence, not negligence concept that you will see in the report from Ed, the financial burden resulting from incident, so it's not only limited to the fiduciary risk, should not fall entirely on the partner's organization, right? So instead of absorbing the cost, we want to create a clear, transparent mechanism to deal with this type of risk. So of course, we are well aware that this limited reserve fund is not like a panacea, right? So it won't solve all the challenge that we face when funding the local organization, but at least for what has been my experience, the lack of such a measure has often discouraged INGO from working with NGOs, and NGO with working with local partner with CVLA. So even when securing the funds to cover the financial losses from incidents wasn't like a major obstacle, the alternative was often the overreaction and a sort of overcompensation. So excessive compliance demands, micromanagement, non-sustainable level of admin burden that ultimately undermine both the project objectives, but also the commitment to localization, right? So this measure of the anchor organization and the risk sharing measure, the reserve fund, is one way we are trying to rebalance that equation, right? So acknowledging that some level of risk is not only inevitable, but acceptable and should be managed collectively and not pushed down the chain. That's kind of the principle behind it. However, I think it's also important to note that this risk-sharing mechanism has been endorsed in principle, and it's while the operationalization is still pending, right? So AFS is currently piloting 2 projects with anchor organization involving 17 CBLAs. 11 of them are woman-led organizations. These are still in their inception phase, which should end towards the end of this month or beginning of August. So we have intentionally delayed the rolling out of the risk-sharing mechanism because we want to also have some lessons learned and discuss this with all the actors involved in the project. So therefore, details such as the size of the reserve for funds or the trigger that are not yet finalized and will be refined based on the lessons learned exercise that we're planning to run soon. So if successful, we are considering to extend the use of the reserve beyond the anchor concept, right? So we also want to give this kind of same sort of arrangement to partners like national NGO working with CBLA, so not only the anchor organization. So importantly, this reserve fund is one of the measures that are part of a broader risk management and shared responsibility framework that sits with the anchor organization concept. So the framework includes some more traditional, like the preventive measures that we discussed, but also some other, we think, innovative risk management measures, such as a collaborative risk management model, which consists on quarterly forum with partners. So this quarterly forum goes, risk management forum goes a bit beyond the traditional risk monitoring by fostering like a structured approach to managing risk. So basically partners within the same allocation alongside subgrantee and CBLAs jointly identified the top common risk during the inception phase and during one of these risk forums that are facilitated by AFS. These risks have been then consolidated into a single shared partner risk register, which all partners use to monitor and report against throughout the implementation of their project. So we have one risk register for all partners that are our partner for a specific allocation. So while organization may, of course, include grant-specific and organizational risk, the jointly defined common risk remains central and are tracked collectively. So what makes this approach, I think, a bit innovative is not just the joint analysis, but also the emphasis on the collaboration and exchange among partners, right? So partners don't just discuss risks, but they explore coordinated responses and practical solutions together. They discuss mitigation measures, and where there is a possibility to collaborate, they co-implement the mitigation measures. So, and also kind of in line with what you mentioned, Ed, before, this risk register and the risks identified by partners influence the AFS pool fund risk register. So our risks are influenced by the risks identified by partner and not vice versa. So yeah, so far we convened 2 rounds of risk management forum, and both of which saw strong participation, and we all got good feedback. Of course, they're held in Arabic, ensuring that all the local actors are fully engaged and contribute meaningfully to the dialogue. So yeah, I think just to sum up, the anchor concept is an AFS way of localizing responsibly by channeling support and resources through qualified partners committed to working with CBLAs and grassroots organizations. The risk sharing mechanism, especially the use of the reserve funds, is a foundational tool that ensures we are not just shifting power, but also sharing instead of transferring risks in a fair and transparent way. And yeah, we are piloting this approach. And if successful, yeah, we will try to adapt and expand the model to strengthen the ecosystem of national and local actors. That's the idea. So yeah, thank you, and over to you, Elise.
Thank you, Fabio. Super, again, very, very concrete, and thank you for all the detail on that, which again underscores the issues of dialogue and understanding through the workshops, but also the very practical question of how do you pay for it, right? Where does the money come from? But really looking forward as well, we will also invite you back in 6 months to see how that your lessons learned comes out of this. And as we said, we're continuing the dialogue going in this community of practice of pooled fund managers. So these lessons learned and sharing will be shared across a variety of pooled funds, CBPFs, locally led feminist funds, et cetera. So that the learning continues to be shared. Can I also invite you, Fabio, in the question and answer, there's a number of questions specifically to you on the anchor organization concept and how it works. So if you do have some chance to answer some of those, otherwise we'll feed back to you on that afterward. Without further ado, let me hand over to Victoria then, when we talk about funding and sources of funding. Where does the money come from? Victoria, if you can share with us your model, and you as a third-party actor is essentially coming in to answer that question of the money.
Yeah,
Victoria, over to you.
Thank you. Perfect segue. So lovely to be here and talking about my favorite subject, which is risk. Risk Pool Alliance has been around since 2018, and we fall firmly in what Ed described as the reactive risk response. So we exist purely to help solve the problem once it's happened. And this is born out of this idea that even the most tried and true approaches are likely to encounter a problem that was unexpected and out of their control. And I think COVID taught all of us that was a reality. So since 2018, we have given 139 applications, and we've given 103 grants. And how the mechanism works is that funders buy into the risk pool, and they then roster any of their organizations that they wish to insure, and they stay on that roster for a year. And during that year, that organization comes directly to the risk pool fund. They do not have to go to their funder, and most don't. They come directly to us, and it is a completely confidential arrangement. The funders that buy into the fund do not get a report on who has applied, on what they applied for, if they got funding and if they didn't. They get a basic financial statement at the end of the year saying, this is how much money you put in and this is how much money we gave away. And this is super important for this mechanism, because we did our own research a couple of years ago, and we found exactly what Ed described, this incredible disconnect between what funders perceive as the most important risks, which are always fraud and compliance, and what implementers see as the most important risks. And what I mean by most important is the things that are most likely to happen. And they report that the things that are most likely to happen are equipment failure, supply chain issues, and bureaucratic delays. Compliance and fraud comes really low down in their realities. And what this means practically is that in the last 8 years, with those 103 grants, we've given away $4.1 million worth of grants. The average grant size is about $40,000. That has protected $235 million worth of total program investment. And of that $235 million that we have protected, $63 million of that is the original investment made by those funders that bought into the fund on behalf of those programs. So this is how we demonstrate that we're not just solving a problem of implementation and an organization is able to carry on providing its services to its communities, which ultimately is the most important thing. We're also ensuring the investment that's been made by the wider funding community, as well as by our funders who have bought in. What's been really interesting over the last 8 years is how the types of risks have shifted. So in the very beginning, we saw a lot of those internal risks. We saw a lot of personnel problems, equipment failures, things like that. Obviously, COVID accounts for 22% of all grants that we've given. But as of about 11 o'clock last night, when I reran the numbers, funder-created obstacles accounted for 22%. And that's because of what's happened in the last 6 months. So until a year ago, if you asked me if funder-created obstacles were a big part of the problem, I would have said not according to my data. I was seeing less than about 10% of my grants were funder-created obstacles. That is no longer the case as of 2025. And I don't need to tell anyone here. What makes the Risk Pool Alliance special is obviously the separation from your original funder, and that ability to come directly to us and know that we are not going to tell anyone, speak to anyone, means that you can be really transparent, you can be really quick in coming to us, you don't have to wait and try and solve the problem in lots of other ways, you can come straight to us. We're very fast and very light touch, and people always laugh at me when I say that, but I was an implementer for a lot longer than I've been a funder. And when I say fast and light touch, our application form is 2 pages. I'm told by those that fill it in, it can take less than an hour, and we can move money incredibly quickly. And I do mean incredibly quickly. 23 hours from getting an application to getting the money in the bank is the fastest I've ever done it. It's usually, there are a couple of outliers, but it's usually within 4 or 5 days we can get the money to people, which frankly, in terms of our funders who buy into the fund, they just simply don't, with all the best will in the world, they simply cannot operate to that speed. And even when a funder is bought into supporting their partners, they may not have the staff time. They also have to work within certain guardrails. We don't have that because these are all pre-vetted organizations. So our need to do due diligence has been lessened by the fact that the funders have already done that due diligence. So that allows us to be a lot quicker. What I would say is, people always ask me, does it work? It's a great question. Does it work? We did our own evaluation a couple of years ago, and 97% of all of the organizations that received a grant from us reported that it had completely alleviated their problem and kept their program on track. So yes, and we're talking small injections of cash at a moment when what you need to do is buy a new vehicle so that you can keep your team on the road, or your office is flooded and you need new equipment, or there's been an unexpected outbreak of a disease that you hadn't planned to and you need PPE for your team. For us, the really secret sauce in all of this is that I don't make the decision. The funders who buy into the fund don't make the decision. We have a pool of external reviewers. This is a group of experts. We have about 150 people on that pool covering health, humanitarian, education, and livelihoods. A number of them are extra special and they can do more than one, which is wonderful. And this group of external review panels who are predominantly proximate to the work. We've worked really hard to get local actors to review on our behalf. We have the ability to review not only in English, you know, we accept application forms in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic, and we have in the past on an occasion done so in Portuguese. We can make things work. These folk are the ones who make the decision. They are paid. That is super important to us. We're not asking anyone to volunteer their time and their expertise. These are people who are experts in their field, and they are paid for that service. They review, they ask questions directly via me, but directly to the applicant about what is the problem. They come up with recommendations that might alter the program, and they make the ultimate decision. And that separation and that engagement with an external review panel is really, really important in de-risking transparency, because what our research showed is that implementers have problems every day. Those of us that were or are implementers know that. And your first phone call is never to your funder. But it's even hard to go to another source unless you know that it's safe to do so. And so that's why this, this level of transparency that people can have with us as the Risk Pool Alliance is because we have these guardrails in place that makes it safe for them to do so. So I'm gonna stop there. I could talk for a very long time, but I'm aware that there are others, and I want to make sure that there's time for questions.
Victoria, really, thank you so much. I think for me, you're the best kept secret, and I would be ready to go to scale eventually, because when this comes out, you may have a lot of clients. Let me then pass over to one of your investors. So Federico and the VTOL Foundation. Again, super interesting with the VTOL Foundation, with others is doing with the Resilio Fund and in funding mutual aid groups, especially in Sudan. And again, where you have to be super conscious about risk and risk transfer onto smaller actors. So Federico, over to you, please.
Thanks, Elise, and hi everyone. Yeah, I think I thought I'd probably, it's important to sort of preface everything I'm going to say from the perspective of the fact that I occupy a relatively privileged position to have within the private philanthropic space, that we have quite a high concept or notion of risk tolerance, and so everything I say looks at like how we put that into practice and sort of what it means in relation to what role we play in the space as a whole. So I thought it'd be, it's interesting to see the fact that like a lot of things that we're engaged in, a lot of the spaces that AFS occupies in Sudan with the Sudan Humanitarian Fund. And of course, we are a co-founder, member of the early investor in the Risk Pool Alliance. I mean, I think the reality is that from our perspective, sort of we see risk in different ways, and I think one of the things that we are really conscious of is the fact that like we primarily look at pooled funds as a tool to invest in, so that we can enable the fund to take that greater risk, and primarily that the way that we do that is by offering greater flexibility. I think flexibility is the number one element that sort of helps people manage risks, and enables therefore also the conversations that play out from there. So I mean, just touching on Sudan really quickly, we were able to engage. Our mandate has been very strongly around looking at how we can help community-led responses, and we're able to engage, not directly, I will say that. I mean, we also have our own compliance limitations, I guess, but what we were able to pass on is the flexible funding that allowed the partners on the ground to sort of explore how they wanted to manage risk, right? And I think what I was going to say is that I sort of see collaboration as a really, really interesting risk-sharing tool, and I don't think it comes up enough in conversations. I think, a competitive funding environment tends to push more onto a risk sharing or a risk management framework that sort of defines you versus another, right? And I think actually what we're seeing from mutual aid initiatives and sort of the community-led or response framework is that risk is best managed when you're working alongside one another. And I think, you know, the outcome of Sudan that is most remarkable is the system of reporting that was designed ultimately by the mutual aid actors. No one imposed it on them. The degree with which they, you know, the system looks at the details of processes, let's say, and how that's reported. I mean, you know, to some degree, we were even asking, like, is that even needed? I mean, you know, so and the response was, yeah, because this holds us accountable and it allows us to put in place sort of standards that we believe necessary. And now that F system of reporting, you know, is a standard in the Sudan response, one that even, by my understanding, the Sudan Humanitarian Forum accepts. Fund, sorry, not forum. The Sudan Humanitarian Fund accepts and is critical to the whole system of you know, risk management. You know, I think the philanthropy has a particular role also in exploring how we can sort of work alongside pooled funds to support a sort of risk mitigation, and that kind of takes me on to something that I think you know, I've always been really interested in, which is the fact that, like, I really do see what the report terms as subcontractors, but what we call sort of intermediaries. I think the role of the intermediaries is critical, and that's also where I think the philanthropy and sort of more risk tolerant players in the ecosystem can support how risk is sort of shared. And particularly what I mean by that is that, you know, I think where we can come in is sort of look at, you know, we need to look at the role or the interplay between pooled funds and the intermediaries that they provide the funding to, because I do think that intermediaries can maybe not necessarily contrary, but sort of, I know the report spoke a lot about sort of how you share risk, but and not put it all on the shoulders of one entity, but perhaps you know, part of the value add of certain intermediaries is to take on that risk. And that means also ensuring that they are properly invested in so that they don't have to pass it down. And I think that is particularly where we sort of land and where, you know, what we think is the potential future. And then really thinking about intermediaries as specialized players who, you know, also provide a kind of technical support on a thematic, a sector, or a geography, or whatever. But, like, you know, so it's almost like within the intermediary, you're building the blocks for collaborative responses that share risk and share, you know, and provides for that community-based sort of structuring of processes that are meaningful and contextualized to the local needs. But then the intermediaries have a competitive environment in which they're also trying to demonstrate their value add and how they can deliver that risk flexibility, or the flexibility and risk sharing, or completely taking the risk away on behalf of those who represent their constituent stakeholders, and therefore where philanthropic players and where notions or concepts like the Risk Pool Alliance come in for us, is that then we can nominate the intermediaries to the Risk Pool Alliance, so that, I mean, you know, if it gets to the right scale, by the way, I should point that out before I give Vicky a heart attack, but you know, at the right scale, potentially the intermediaries can be nominated so that they can also sort of support through these other mechanisms that are not directly linked to who they're receiving funding from. Because as Vicky pointed out, you know, the number one thing that is still a problem, and even for the most flexible, open, risk-tolerant funder, you know, ultimately there is still a power play dynamic where people don't want to talk about things that are unforeseen and that are affecting them. And which are potentially driving a sort of inability or risk towards being able to deliver the impact that they want. And so even with us, we know that some of our partners won't come to us, and the Risk Pool Fund is a way for us to deliver on that. But equally, the Risk Pool Fund also means that we can do much more. To Fabio's earlier point, you know, there's only so much that a contingency fund or line can provide, you know, it's not infinite, right? So a pooled version of, or pooling our funds in a risk pool alliance type framework means that we can also sort of provide much more than what we could do individually. So yeah, I think there's some really interesting things happening. You know, for us, one of the ways that we are now sort of taking what we've learned in Sudan and Ethiopia, the Philippines, Myanmar, etc., around this hyper-local notion of mutual aid and how we can support it. We're putting it into we're establishing the Resilio Fund to deliver this. For us, it's a risk. You know, I'll be honest. It's a way for us to take risks and really push things because we're sort of dispersing risk amongst a number of funders. So pooled funds have that role too. But with the ambition to allow the Resilio Fund to be as flexible as it needs to be, to approach risk in as simple and representative or contextualized manner as possible, so they can then deliver, so that the people that receive the funds and the organizations and institutions that receive the funds from them can do what they need to do without having to deal with risk too much. I'll leave it there.
Federico, really, really thank you. And let me thank everyone. I mean, absolutely. I think this notion of flexibility being the most critical thing for effective risk sharing, and this idea that the role and the characteristics and the support given to the intermediaries, as you call them, absolutely critical. So really thank you for that, as well as the engagement. Let me kick off the question and answer session. Please, for all those in the audience, please, if you have more questions, keep them coming into the question and answer function. I want to pick up on a first question that I'm going to pose to all of you, but please, volunteer whoever thinks it most appropriate to answer. From Ada and both from Rory, this is a question about the valuation of risk, and can you value or quantify who shares what risk, and therefore who should get what money to support that risk? Because we often find that sharing of overheads, sharing of admin costs between the intermediaries, or between the back donors, the pooled fund, the intermediary, and the final operational entities, is like a bed sheet which is way too small being pulled across, right? Have any of you done work in the sense of actually helping to value or put a quantitative amount, right, on who should get what money to manage essentially which risk? We know, I think from the report that Ed, from your report, Ed, it's in terms of preventative budget, we do start managing that and budgeting that better. But in terms of taking on that reactive or that risk component itself, do we quantify that in some way? So maybe let me ask that question first. And in the meantime, please keep on putting questions into the chat, into the function. Ed, you on that one?
Yeah, I'll just jump in on that one first and let the colleagues come in as well if necessary. I think I would just sort of reflect backwards on some of the other things we've spoken about, because I think what we shouldn't start by is thinking about risk sharing as just a money thing. Because actually, when we looked in the report, what you see in the detail is a lot of the time the measures we're talking about are not financial, actually. Like if you look at the compliance risks from not being able to comply with partner contract terms for downstream partners, there's a lot of things that donors and pooled funds and those prime recipients can do in their own contract terms to still manage the risk they're worried about without generating that new risk for their partners. And then you don't necessarily need the money. So I'm not saying that there is never a cost with a preventive measure. Sometimes you're going to need PPE, sometimes you'll need armored vehicles, you're going to need training. But it's about saying, if you start from the point of what Federico was saying, and you have a genuinely collaborative dialogue, which is one of the foundational principles of risk sharing within the risk sharing framework of the Grand Bargain, then you are going to be able to get to a dialogue where you see a holistic picture of risk. and then you can have a genuine conversation about what it takes to manage those risks. And if you're doing that in an equitable way, you shouldn't have to limit yourself to a zero-sum equation about, like, you know, this is how much money's in the pot and this is therefore how we have to divide it. There's certainly issues of budget. There's no getting around that. But to be honest, when you look at the really big issues in risk sharing, it's not a lot of the time about money. It's about the predictability of risk consequences. There's a lot of agencies out there who can work as intermediaries and actually absorb quite a lot of risk. It's the unpredictability that tends to be the thing that makes them take a more conservative position and amp up that compliance for their downstream partners. So the short answer is no, we haven't tried to value the risk in anything I've seen so far. And I would say that wouldn't necessarily be a helpful approach for this on its own. It could be one aspect of an overall approach. The risk sharing dialogues that have been happening in various countries, there was one in Kampala that looked specifically about this issue about ERRs and how to unlock funding there. And that was where the F system came up last year. And there's been a bit of progress on that. There's another one coming up in South Sudan that's being led by all the Red Cross entities. There was a desktop one in Geneva a couple of years ago. Various people are doing their own pilots in smaller delivery chains as well. So there is learning. It's coming through slowly. So happy to talk more about that offline. Back to you, Elise.
Thanks, Ed. Any other thoughts on that one? Otherwise, I'll go to the next question on the Q&A. So there's this question from, I think it's from Karen McDonald, on that we speak about, compliance with, again, as the report highlighted, this ISO 31000, very sort of Western, quote unquote, legalistic approach to risk. As a lawyer, of course, I understand it, but what would be the alternative, right? Is there an alternative to basically essentially, I'm giving you my money, I trust you with it. If there's a problem under your watch, you're going to have to reimburse me or take the consequences of it, right? Like, is this a Western-dominated notion? Is there alternatives to this? Over to the panelists.
I don't want to dominate the conversation. I think Federico could probably speak a little bit to maybe the ERRs, but because I think as a perfect example, we all know that a lot of our compliance controls are total rubbish, actually. Total nonsense. A lot of them just don't work. Not appropriate to context, not appropriate to the actual risks we're facing. If I were to look at one issue in relation to funding for ERRs, in the early stages, you saw donors going, well, yeah, I want to get money there and I want fingerprints and I want names and I want everything else. And that created and generated a huge amount of risks for ineligibility of costs for direct implementers and these intermediaries. But at the same time, it didn't necessarily control the risk. We all know those lists can be fraudulently altered, right? On the other hand, if you look at the sort of upwards accountability to affected populations that is in place within the ERRs, the money gets sent to someone. People know in advance who is receiving the money. It goes in a relatively small amount. That person is living in that community within their extended family network. It's just not feasible for them to walk off with the money. And even if it was, because the money's going in multiple small tranches to multiple individuals, you've got herd safety there. If one of these links does turn out to be a wrong one, you can tie it off and not use that route again. And if you think about acceptable risk in a sort of group cash transfer scenario, that there's a solid accountability to affected population measure that can manage your risk. It just doesn't happen to be the one we normally used to use. But tell me that's not better than this like upward accountability to donor risk management measure, which doesn't really line up with our other commitments. Federico, I don't know if you've got anything you'd like to sort of add to that, and apologies for jumping in on it.
I will second that, and you hit the nail on the head. I think the question of appropriate risk management also sits in the approach. I think we group. It was really great to see the micro grants or group cash transfers noted as a tool. But let's be honest, it is only a tool. It's a means to an end. The only way the group cash transfers manages risk or from a purely sort of technical risk perspective addresses the thing is the approach and the way that cash transfer happens. I mean, mutual aid is particularly interesting because it's so organic and as Ed said, it's people that can't just. I mean, obviously, someone can just pick up and leg it, right, with money. But again, to Vicky's points and others, when you look at the data, that's not really the biggest risk. Actually, far from it. So and actually, what mutual accountability, as much as mutual solidarity, is able to achieve, is to also create the environment in which people can help each other with all of those things that actually are the big risk elements, right? So, but that doesn't, let's be, a reality also is that money sort of ends up corrupting as well. So it's as much about the actual micro grant nature of the tool as it is, and in fact, it's much more the way that the engagement has happened, what preceded the actual cash transfer, and how you do it that really works. And I think Sudan, Myanmar, all these places where mutual aid has particularly flourished is also because, to some degree, the international system has been pushed aside. And as a result, this was able to sort of take root because it's natural to those communities to behave that way. That kind of mutual trust is there. Actually, it's everything that we bring that is unnatural, right? And therefore requires the upward accountability, etc. So, yeah, I definitely think that Western sort of notion needs to be challenged, but appropriately positioned, perhaps.
Thank you on that one. Let me know that there's 3 or 4 questions around due diligence, and maybe Martina, maybe for you and Fabio as well to answer this one. One question is around to what extent is due diligence assessments used as a form to start a risk-sharing conversation, right? Through due diligence, we can help that engagement, that identification of a risk shared by everyone's different risks, not just the donors' risks. And there's again the question about the introduction about passporting and due diligence passporting into this. How we all know that we need much more due diligence passporting. There's no question about it, right? Including through this CHS, as this is another question about the core humanitarian standard, and using that as the heart of passporting. But if there is passporting, how do you still make sure that risk conversation and that capacity strengthening conversation, that one-on-one engagement dialogue still happens, right? So maybe thoughts on due diligence, passporting, and risk-sharing conversations, risk understanding. Martina, do you want to say a word about that in terms of the Ukraine experience? I think very relevant.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And I think, this is really, it's very close to my heart because I think due diligence and passporting is almost always the beginning of the conversation, right? I mean, it's where on a one-on-one, I mean, obviously you need to do kind of risk management in the contextual, at the contextual level and at the kind of, countrywide response level. But then once you start engaging with a specific organization on a due diligence, capacity assessment, that's really when you start getting to know each other and you can have this conversation about, what are really the kind of strengths and weaknesses of an organization, what's their value added, how they can better fit into the response, how they can improve so that they can become a stronger partner, and then you can kind of strengthen also the kind of locally led response. Now, I think we do in the CBPS have a lot of experience with this because obviously we have a range of partners. We fund over 700 NGOs a year, right? So our range of engagement with the due diligence and capacity assessment process is such that we have really learned how how, by OCHA does its due diligence and capacity assessment directly, right? In all but one country, it's our teams who go to the partners' offices, go to the project sites, and they do in-person assessments so that they can really get to know the organization. Now, I think this is really a valuable process because it allows us to understand where this organization is at. It's true that sometimes the results, the outcomes, the approach that we have in these efforts are very kind of Western centric and kind of private sector led and, risk adverse. So I think, there is a lot of work that needs to be done at that initial stage to, first of all, understand what are the absolute minimum things that we need to be checking and asking to make sure that that organization can actually thrive with our funding, okay? I think we shouldn't underestimate the fact that sometimes humanitarian aid can destroy a local organization because we're overwhelming them with too much money, much more that they can actually manage. So we are setting them up for failure by not really knowing what are, what's their I don't want to say capacity, but what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, right? So I think that actually there is a value in the assessment process, but this value needs to come out more strongly. So in the context of Ukraine, what we've done is we've kept our standard assessment process and questionnaire, but we actually, first of all, lowered the thresholds, right? So we said everybody, every national NGO that meets our absolute red lines can become eligible. If their rating is below a certain threshold, they can still be eligible. They're not going to be ineligible, but that means that we need to work more closely with them. They can access smaller grants because their capacity to manage grants is more limited. They can access grants with more limited compliance requirements. There's a capacity development component that we're going to work with them on, that we're going to work with other partners that subgrant to them on. So this kind of hand-in-hand approach that really used the initial assessment as a way to help the organization progress. And then last but not least, I think, we do a lot of work in not only through the due diligence and assessment process, but through our monitoring, our auditing, our financial spot check to really understand what are the challenges and strengths of our local responders in a given country. And that informs our risk management approach at that country level, right? Because if everybody is struggling with some things and it comes out in every monitoring, in every financial spot check, in every audit, that is a critical component of our, how we're going to mitigate, manage, and potentially share the risks that we face in a given country. So I want to give a positive word and say that actually I think it is true. I mean, we need to change a lot, but I don't necessarily think that we need to dismantle everything we have from day to night, because there's a lot of good and positive elements that come from our risk management approaches that allow us to understand better the risk context that we face. But certainly there's a lot more that we need to do to kind of chip away at the requirements, at the bureaucracy, and make what we have more effective and kind of driven by what we're trying to achieve. And last but not least, I think, Elise, all the organizations on this panel, we all come to this table with very different perspectives, very different governance frameworks, rules and regulations. And so I think what we need to understand is that risk sharing is not a one size fits all. It's really trying to unpack how different organizations coming together can change their approach to risk management. And I think the beauty of this is that we all have learnings and good practices that we can learn from and that we can then tap into as a collective. Thank you.
Martina, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that will have to be our last word as we're coming to the end of this launch event. Really, thank you. I'm very sorry that we couldn't open the floor to pick live questions given the number of people on the call. But just to say, really thank all of you for everything, all the rich input that you've put into the chat. I look forward to keep on reading it. Thank you for the questions being done. Really warm thank you to all our panelists. I think extremely interesting. Of course, the time allowed does not give justice to the range of topics and questions, but I do think we're able to go a bit more deeply on certain of these topics than the report itself does, of course. So great that the report has launched this conversation and really, taken us one step closer to where we need to be going to really improving risk sharing. Thank you again. Have a wonderful afternoon. And please continue to put, thoughts. You can keep on putting thoughts in the chats and questions in the chats, and we will try to really answer it in the work going forward, and watch the space. We'll try to reconvene you maybe in 6 months, 1 year, so we can touch base on all the progress that's been made. Thank you, everyone. Have a good morning, afternoon, depending on where you are.
Thank you, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Bye.
Thank you.